In May 1974, Brian May collapsed. He was in New York, a month into Queen's first American tour, the tour that was supposed to establish the band in the largest music market in the world. The tour they had been working towards since 1970, the tour that was going to be everything. And then Brian May collapsed. Hepatitis, the doctor said. He needed hospitalization. He needed months of rest. The remaining American dates were canceled. The four of them flew back to England. And then, while Brian was still recovering, he collapsed again, this time from a chronic colon condition so severe that the people around him genuinely believed he might not survive it. Queen's guitarist was in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. Their American breakthrough had not happened. Their first two albums had underperformed. The music press had been unkind. The specific window of momentum that a young band gets, the window that either opens into a career or closes permanently, was sitting there, neither open nor closed, while the person who played the guitar was in a hospital. Everyone who understood how the music industry worked in 1974 understood what this situation meant for Queen, and Freddie Mercury walked into Trident Studios and started making sheer heart attack. To understand what Freddie Mercury did in the summer of 1974, you have to understand what Queen were and were not at that point. They were not successful, not in the way the word success carries weight. They had two albums out, Queen and Queen 2, and neither had broken through in the way that the band's ambition required. Queen 2 had done better than the debut, had reached the top 5 in the UK, had given them a taste of what real chart success felt like. But it had not translated into the kind of career-defining momentum that makes a band's future feel certain rather than possible. The American market, which was where the real commercial scale lived, had not responded to either record in the way that would have made the first US tour a continuation of existing success, rather than an attempt to create something from scratch. They were a band in the specific and vulnerable position of having demonstrated their potential without having converted it. The window was open. Nothing was guaranteed. And then Brian May went to hospital. The specific sequence of events that interrupted Queen's 1974 trajectory has two parts, and both matter. The first part was the hepatitis contracted from a dirty needle during the inoculations required for the band's planned Australian tour earlier in the year, not diagnosed until Brian collapsed during the New York leg of the American tour in May. That alone was serious enough to cancel the American dates and bring the band home. But the second part was worse. While basic recording sessions for the new album were already beginning at Trident Studios in London in July 1974, with Queen working as a three-piece, Deacon deputizing on guitar where necessary, Brian May was hospitalized again with a chronic colon condition that those around him have described as genuinely life-threatening. This was not a manageable inconvenience. This was a man who might not come back, and the album was already in progress. The tour was gone. The momentum window was closing, and the only person in a position to decide what happened next was Freddie Mercury. 3 people, no guitarist, the guitarist in a hospital, possibly dying, Queen's American breakthrough canceled, their 2 albums underperforming in the market that mattered most. This was the specific situation that faced Freddie Mercury in the summer of 1974. Most bands in this situation would have paused, waited, let the situation resolve itself. Freddie Mercury decided it was time to make the best album Queen had ever made. What Freddie Mercury did in the summer of 1974 is one of the most undertold stories in Queen's history, and it is undertold precisely because the result, sheer heart attack, the album that broke Queen into the mainstream, was so complete and so confident that it is difficult, looking back at it, to see the specific conditions under which it was made. It was made without the band's lead guitarist for a significant portion of its recording. It was made while that guitarist was in a hospital bed in a condition serious enough that his return could not be assumed. It was made by a band in the specific state of suspended animation that crises create, unable to tour, uncertain about the future, needing to produce something that would justify the record company's continued investment and the audience's continued attention. And Freddie Mercury sat at the piano in Trident Studios and wrote Killer Queen. And then he wrote and recorded the rest of an album that announced, with the specific confidence of someone who has decided what the situation is going to mean and is proceeding on that basis, that Queen had not finished. They had barely started. Killer Queen was not the obvious record for a rock band in the specific situation Queen were in to make. It was not a straightforward heavy rock track designed to reassert the band's identity after 2 albums of multi-layered progressive excess. It was something more surprising and more specific than that. A camp, theatrical, music hall-influenced pop song with a lyric about a high-class prostitute, harmonies layered with the same obsessive precision that had defined the first 2 albums, and a musical sophistication that was entirely Freddie Mercury's and that had no precedent in anything Queen had previously released. Freddie Mercury wrote it while his guitarist was in hospital. He wrote it by his own account, sitting at a piano and following the musical idea wherever it went, without reference to what Queen were supposed to sound like or what a band in their commercial position needed to produce. He followed the idea. The idea led him to a song that reached number 2 in the UK singles chart and number 12 in the US Queen's first proper international hit, the record that turned their situation from critical to transformed. Killer Queen reached number 2 in the UK 12 in America. Sheer Heart Attack reached number 2 in the UK albums chart. All of this was produced by 3 people, one of them filling in on guitar, while the band's actual guitarist was recovering from a condition that had nearly killed him. Think about that sequence. 3 people. One of them deputizing, the guitarist in hospital, and they made their most commercially successful record to that point. That is not luck. That is Freddie Mercury deciding what was going to happen. Brian May returned to the Sheer Heart Attack sessions when his health had stabilized enough to allow him to work. He has described coming back to recordings that were already underway and finding something that surprised him, not in the sense of being unexpected from Freddie, whose ambition and musical intelligence he knew completely, but in the sense of being further advanced and more fully formed than he had anticipated. Freddie Mercury had not been waiting. He had been building. The album that Brian May returned to was not a collection of holding patterns tracks, maintained in draft form until the guitarist was available to complete them. It was an album in progress, with direction and shape and specific musical ideas that had been developed in his absence and that he now needed to contribute to rather than lead. This is a subtle but significant thing. Brian May came back to a record that Freddie Mercury had made decisions about. Not all the decisions Queen was always a collaborative unit, and the album's final form reflected all 4 of them, but the foundational ones: the direction, the ambition, the refusal to wait. Roger Taylor and John Deacon were not passive participants in the summer of 1974. John Deacon, in particular, played guitar on portions of the album in Brian May's absence, an unusual role for a bassist, and one he approached with the specific quiet competence that characterized everything John Deacon did when the situation required it. Roger Taylor provided the rhythmic foundation and the specific quality of energy that his drumming always gave Queen's recordings. But both of them understood, in the specific way that band members understand things when one member is operating at a higher frequency than the others, that what was happening in those sessions was primarily Freddie Mercury's work. Not because he excluded them, because he was the one who had decided to proceed, and the deciding set the direction. The others followed it. This is not a diminishment of Roger Taylor or John Deacon. Both were essential to what the album became. It is a recognition of who was driving. And who was driving was Freddie Mercury. The critical reception of Sheer Heart Attack when it was released in November 1974 was, by the standards of what Queen had experienced from the music press to that point, remarkably positive. The NME called it a feast. The BBC wrote about multi-layered vocals and guitars, and Freddie Mercury's vaudevillian streak finally emerging, describing it as the album that saw Queen find their true voice. This was not the response the music press had given Queen 2, which had been praised by some and dismissed by others. Sheer Heart Attack achieved something closer to critical consensus, a sense that the band had arrived at something real, and the commercial performance matched it. Number 2 in the UK albums chart, a genuine US chart presence for the first time, Killer Queen as a genuine international hit single. The specific turnaround between the band's situation in May 1974 and their situation in November 1974, Between canceled tour and collapsing guitarist and uncertain future, and critically acclaimed album and first international hit, is one of the most dramatic in the history of British rock. And it was produced by a decision Freddie Mercury made in a studio in London in the summer of 1974. 6 months. That is the interval between Brian May collapsing in New York in May and Sheer Heart Attack being released in November. 6 months from the worst moment to the breakthrough. 6 months that contained a guitarist in hospital and an uncertain future, and Freddie Mercury sitting at a piano in Trident Studios, deciding that the future was going to be what he said it was. The summer of 1974 is the first fully documented example of the specific quality that would define Freddie Mercury's relationship to crisis across his entire career. The refusal to allow external circumstances to determine what was possible. It was not recklessness. He was not pretending the situation was not serious. Brian May's illness was serious. The canceled American tour was serious. The uncertainty about the band's future was serious. He understood all of it. And having understood it, he made a different decision than the one the circumstances seemed to call for. The circumstances called for waiting. He decided not to wait. The circumstances called for managing expectations. He decided to exceed them. The circumstances called for a record that demonstrated survival. He decided to make a record that demonstrated ambition. This pattern, not the specific music, but the specific quality of decision-making in the face of adverse conditions, is the thing that appears again and again in the Queen story. Live Aid, the Innuendo sessions, the South American tour, the show must go on. Every major moment in which Freddie Mercury and Queen exceeded what seemed possible was, at its root, Freddie Mercury making the same decision he made in the summer of 1974. The decision to proceed as if the outcome he wanted was the one that was going to happen. Brian May has described Freddie Mercury's creative process in terms that consistently return to a specific quality: the absence of doubt in the moment of making. Not the absence of difficulty. The sessions were often difficult. The creative friction was genuine, but the absence of doubt about whether the thing being made was worth making. Freddie Mercury in a recording studio operated with a certainty beyond confidence, a quality of being entirely inside the work, without the part of the mind that doubts it. This is what made it possible to sit in Trident Studios in the summer of 1974, with his guitarist in hospital and his American tour canceled, and the press not yet convinced, and write Killer Queen. Not trying to write a hit, writing the song that was in his head with complete commitment, in the specific way of someone who does not question whether what they are making deserves to exist. Brian May walked back into those sessions from a hospital bed and found an album taking shape. He found Killer Queen already written. He found Freddie Mercury already decided. And what he contributed from that point was not the direction, but the completion. The direction had already been set by the person who had decided, in the middle of a crisis, that the crisis was not the point. Sheer Heart Attack became the foundation on which everything Queen subsequently built was possible. Without it, without the specific commercial and critical breakthrough it represented, without Killer Queen as Queen's first proper international hit, without the particular quality of ambition and craft it demonstrated, A Night at the Opera would not have been made in the way it was made, with the budget and the creative freedom it required. Bohemian Rhapsody would not have been produced as a 6-minute single in 1975 if the record company and the audience did not already understand, from Sheer Heart Attack, that Queen were capable of extraordinary things. The entire arc of Queen's career from 1975 onward, the albums, the tours, the Live Aid performance, everything was built on the foundation that Sheer Heart Attack laid. And that foundation was laid in the specific conditions of crisis and uncertainty that the summer of 1974 created, by 3 people. One of them deputizing on guitar, the guitarist in hospital, and Freddie Mercury at the piano, writing. Brian May came back from the hospital, he recovered, he played on the album. He has spoken across the years since about the Sheer Heart Attack sessions, with a specific quality of retrospective gratitude. Gratitude not just for the record's success, but for the specific experience of returning to a situation that had been held together in his absence. He came back to an album that was already becoming something, because Freddie Mercury had decided it was going to become something, regardless of what the circumstances suggested. That decision, made in May or June or July of 1974, in a studio in London, with no guitarist and a canceled American tour and an uncertain future, in the specific privacy of a man sitting at a piano and following a musical idea, because that is what he did, regardless of everything else, is where the story of Queen actually begins. Not in 1970, when they formed. Not in 1973, when they released their first album. In 1974, when everything went wrong and Freddie Mercury walked into a studio alone and started making the record that would change everything. That is when Queen became Queen. That is who he was.